Unless you keep a prisoner in a glass box and don't let him have any contact with any individual whatsoever, you are going to get contraband into prisons. There are so many different ways. You know, I've had dead pigeons fall at my feet, belly up, sewn up with drugs. My staff have searched babies with dirty nappies, with drugs inside. First couple of years of my life, up till I was about 10, I lived in the United States. And then my mum and I came back to England in about 1972. And I happened to be in London one weekend and I saw a poster on the tube for the prison service. And I thought that would suit me, meeting people, quite structured. I think under the poster it said something like, "You too could make a difference." And I thought, well, maybe I can, so I'll give it a shot. And that's what I did.
Holloway was the first prison that you worked at.
Yeah.
What was Holloway like then?
Holloway was, the old Holloway was a very Victorian prison. It was knocked down, the old Holloway, in about the 1970s. And a new Holloway was built. And this was built like a hospital because they believed at that time that women were mad and not bad. I can only say that it was on par with an old mental institution.
What was your first day on the job like?
First day in the job, well, you can imagine the cat calls and the name calling and the jibing by women prisoners that you got as you walk through the corridors. I mean, I rocked up to the gate, and on the gate, the senior officer in the gate at Holloway at that time, she's actually a really good friend of mine now. She said, "What do you lot want?" That was it was very hierarchical. If you were a young sprog, you made the tea, you didn't go in the office. I wasn't quite prepared for sort of just anything that a prisoner sort of has the ability to get hold of, whether that be contraband or just an everyday object can be turned into some type of weapon. Prisoners could buy tins of tuna from the canteen, and of course, like when you open a tin of tuna, you've got a lovely jagged edge. You can get toothbrushes which are melted at one end and razor blades sunk into it. They used to say if you could work at Holloway, you could work anywhere, and I firmly believe that was true.
Who would you say the most notorious individuals are that you've come into contact with?
Prisoners who are in the headlights, who are high up in the media, like Rose West, Myra Hindley. The media makes these people out to be something they're not. They make them out to be notorious.
What was she like, Rose West?
Rose West was, we used to call her Auntie Rose, not to her face, but like, have you unlocked Auntie Rose? Because that's what she looked like. She looked like somebody's auntie. She had thick, milk bottle bottom glasses on. We looked after her. That was what our job was. But she was nothing special, and she's still nothing special.
You came into contact with Myra Hindley as well, didn't you?
I did. I met Myra briefly, very briefly. I did a transfer to Cookham Wood, and she was at Cookham Wood at that stage. Very manipulative prisoner. She manipulated a governor to take her to Regent's Park and have an ice cream. Myra Hindley only did what Myra Hindley wanted to do. I was only a young officer, only been in the job at like 18 months, and this little sort of mousy brown woman with this minging old cardigan came shuffling along with sort of like the elbows out and sort of, I think it was brown sort of, or it might have been a denim skirt. She said, "What can I get you, officers?" And I said, "I'll have a cup of tea, please, 2 sugars." And she went round the 3 of us that were there, and off she shuffled again. And when you say the word Myra Hindley, people think of the infamous picture of her with bleach blonde hair, with the piercing eyes, staring straight ahead. And she was nothing like that. You wouldn't have known her if you'd have tripped over. For the next 11 years, I stayed at Holloway, and then I moved to Wormwood Scrubs. And then my boss, that was the next governor level up, was a Governor 4. She went off she retired, and they asked me to step into her shoes. And so within the space of probably 4 years, I'd gone from a senior officer right the way up to a Governor 4. So my job was basically to keep the jail safe and secure, and trying to tackle the amount of drugs that came into the jail.
Do you mind sort of getting into that then, actually, contraband coming into prison?
Well, contraband is, it's the sort of bogey of every single prison. And by contraband, it can be anything from, hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, soft drugs, spice, cannabis, mobile phones, mobile phone chargers, SIM cards, alcohol, all these sorts of things are contraband. And they contribute to violence, bullying, assaults, a very unstable prison. And the thing with contraband coming in, there are so many different ways. I've had dead pigeons fall at my feet, belly up, sewn up with drugs. I've had my staff have searched babies with dirty nappies with drugs inside. Prisoners used to have food parcels coming in, because any sort of chocolate bars that were sent in, we used to have to break them up into little pieces. And whoever sent this Kit Kat in had managed to reseal the whole Kit Kat packet, had sort of very delicately dug a bit of the Kit Kat out, poured a little wrap of heroin in it down one of the, the biscuits, and then poured chocolate over it. And, prisoners will think of any sort of means or to get drugs in. We had one woman who was a prolific drug addict, and her mother, at that time, female prisoners were allowed to have flowers in on a weekly basis. And her mother every week used to send her a bouquet of flowers in, and there were drugs in the stalks of the flowers, little wraps of heroin. And her mother used to supply her daughter with these drugs. And you could never understand it. We used to say to her, Maureen, you haven't got your flowers again, because guess what? Your mother had put drugs in them again. But, unless you keep a prisoner in a glass box and don't let him have any contact with any individual whatsoever, you are going to get contraband into prisons. And the problem nowadays is that, we have a lot of old Victorian prisons that aren't fit for purpose. And technology has moved on in this climate. So now they have drones bringing drugs over. So, as I said, when one door is shut, another one will open. And when you catch one dealer, you can bet your bottom dollar by close of play that day, there'll be somebody else stepping into their shoes.
So what would like a typical day look like for you?
When you ask me about a typical day at a jail, there is no such thing as a typical day. Yes, you have a routine that you're trying to adhere to, but the slightest thing can throw that out. Nobody prepares you, for self-harm, for seeing somebody take a chunk out of their wrist and spitting the flesh out on the floor. Nobody prepares you for some woman trying to take their eyeball out, or sticking a biro down into her veins in her leg and leaving it to fester and go gangrenous. At that time, when I joined the prison service, there was no aftercare for staff. There was no sort of post-meeting about were all the staff okay. You were just sort of thrown are you all right, Frake? Yeah, fine, thank you. And got on with it, onto your next task. Things like that do have impact on staff. Suicides have impacts on staff. Assaults have impacts on staff. It's a very difficult job, and you see a lot of very difficult things on a daily basis that most people don't see in a lifetime.
I had read that, you dealt with attempted escapes.
Oh yes, I did deal with. Dealt with escapes. There was a guy on. It was one lunchtime, and a guy was feigning illness, and we thought he was feigning illness, but the doctor insisted that he go out to hospital. We tried everything. I begged the doctor not to send him out. He took no notice. I phoned the local police. They said they were too busy, but they'd send a car going past. We phoned the hospital security to warn them that we felt that this was going to be an escape attempt. And in the end, we had to send him out. And as they came round into the A&E in the ambulance, a car roared up, hit the back of the ambulance. The ambulance staff obviously got out to look what was going on, to be faced with two men with guns demanding that this prisoner was uncuffed from one of the staff. He made good his escape. He was at large for about 6 weeks before he was eventually caught. And, the staff were in bits. They, we tried to sort of say to them, you've done absolutely the right thing, because they'd handed the handcuff keys over. The 3 staff that we'd sent with this guy, one never worked again. One downgraded from an officer to an admin grade, and one unfortunately killed himself. So, it has great repercussions, and something that I will remember till I go to my grave.
The difference between like men and women's prisons, what would you say that is one easier than another, or?
For me, personally, I enjoyed working with men much more than females. Women are quite emotional. They're usually the main carers, so they have children and all social problems that go with that. They're much more spontaneous. I've seen dining rooms blow up over the size of somebody's Christmas pud that they didn't think their piece was big enough. Women can be quite nasty in groups, whereas men not so much. They're more as individuals. I think to a degree, male prisoners are more respectful to female staff, and whether that's just goes to sort of as it is on the outside. I've had prisoners hold open doors, and I've had prisoners step in between me and another prisoner, and him saying to the other prisoner, don't talk to the governor like that. And obviously you get the odd one or two here and there that aren't.
Were there any moments where you feared for your own safety, for your own life?
I don't think I've ever feared for my own safety. I think once you decide that you're scared or you're frightened, that is time to give up the job. We had a prisoner who was very abusive to female staff, making sexual innuendos, and I'd put him on basic regime, which basically means that his privileges are taken away, in the hope that he would realise that he can't go around making innuendos and sexual comments to female staff. Anyways, he became very irate over it. Another prisoner came up to me the day before and said, look, Gov, you need to watch your back. Somebody's got it in for you. And I knew exactly who he meant. It was this prisoner that I just put on basic. But the following night, I was working late. I was trying to catch up on some paperwork, and there was an alarm bell went off on D-Wing on the 4th floor. And if that happens, then, it's an audible alarm, and, you rush to it as quickly as you can. And that's what I did. And I got halfway up the landing, and I was just literally stopped in my tracks, covered in this this sort of liquidy stuff. What a prisoner does is he'll put feces and urine in a bottle, add some water, shake it up, and leave it on a radiator for a couple of days. And then find some victim to throw it at. Potting is done to degrade, humiliate, and I was determined that wasn't going to be me. Got a couple of staff with me, went up to this guy's cell, told him that he was going down the Seg, told the staff to grab him, and we marched him off down the Seg. So I hope it was worth it for him.
And did you notice there was like a hierarchy amongst the prisoners as well?
Yeah, there's always a hierarchy amongst prisoners. You know, like I said, there's those that deal drugs, who are quite top of the food chain, and then there's those who are in for driving offences, who come near the bottom, and then the real bottom ones are anybody who offends against children. You know, they're seen as the lowest of the low in jail. If we take, say, Lucy Letby, I can guarantee you she will not be mixing with the rest of the population. You know, she committed the cardinal sin. She murdered babies, and a lot of women are in prison have had to give up their babies because they've ended up in prison or lost babies or whatever. And I expect Lucy Letby will spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder.
So who would you say the most evil person is that you've come into contact with?
The most evil prisoner probably was Colin Ireland. I accidentally bumped into this prisoner and I turned round and I just kept looking up and up. And I mean, he was like 6 foot tall by 6 foot wide. He was a huge guy. And he was the gay killer. He used to, serial killer again, he used to chat up men in Soho and kill them, basically. He had these unbelievable, like, pink staring eyes. I've never seen anybody like it before. And he was probably the one that, like, put the hairs on the back of my neck sort of raised a bit. I could see how he was an absolute killer.
Do you believe that prisoners can be rehabilitated?
I do believe prisoners can be rehabilitated, but they've got to want to be rehabilitated. You know, there are plenty that fight the system and think that they'll beat the system, and the system always wins. I've spoke to lots and lots of prisoners. You know, if I had a pound for every prisoner that said to me, "That's it, miss, I'm never coming back," you know, I would be a billionaire. And a lot of that is to do with the support that prisoners get. You know, bearing in mind, 80% of prisoners can barely read and write. Many have problems with homes. Many have social problems with addictions, drugs, alcohol. When you give somebody a 3-month sentence, bearing in mind they'll only do 6 weeks, there is literally nothing you can do with them in a jail in that time. You know, that person will probably lose their job, lose their home, possibly lose their family, you know, but they'll have had 6 weeks to learn how to be a proper criminal. You know, I get a lot of questions from people sort of saying, how can you talk to prisoners? You know, you should lock the door and throw away the key. But at some stage, you've got to unlock that door and let that person out into society. And if you've treated them like an animal, then you unlock that door and let them out onto society. They're going to behave like an animal. That is fact. You know, I'm not bullshitting here. I left after 27 years. I left in 2013. I got an MBE in 2012. So I was at the pinnacle of my career, really. Wormwood Scrubs was in a great place. It was seen as a trendsetter. Our security systems were in place. Our drugs drug rate was very low in comparison to other London jails. My wife and I have a daughter. At that time, she was always, you know, first in the breakfast club and last out at the tea time club. And I barely saw her for 5 minutes. And I wanted to spend some time with her. You know, I've never been slow in coming forward and speaking out. And I could see myself getting into a bit of bother by constantly speaking out about the cuts and the state of the prison and things like that. And when you start cutting back, then something has to give. And whether that be regimes or whether that be reoffending programs or security systems or whatever, I'd worked my butt off, so would my team, to make Wormwood Scrubs a decent, safe and secure jail. And it was just falling around in front of me, and I thought, well, maybe it just needs a fresh pair of eyes. And so I put in to take redundancy, and I put my redundancy into my pension, and I drew my pension, and I haven't looked back.
Do you miss the job at all?
I did. When I first left work, I missed it dreadfully. I couldn't find my place in society. I felt like, well, I felt lost, if I'm honest. I felt absolutely like, what was the point of my being now? I'd had this regimented job for 27 years. Even now, I have my lunch at 12 o'clock and I count people on the top of a bus. I still am so sort of in the zone of regiments and that from the prison service that it stayed with me for probably will forever. It's not an easy job. I'm not going to sit here and say it is, because it's not. But it is a worthwhile job, and it doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. There's nothing more satisfying than, seeing somebody walk out of a jail and them not coming back and them turning their life around. That makes it worthwhile.
A car pulled up next to me, the window wound down. I got chucked a package into my car, which was yay big, and then I got chucked £400 in rolled up notes. To which point I'm sat in a car then thinking, what have I just done?